He was born into darkness. He became it. And he never apologized. Konrad Curze, the Night Haunter.
You know what makes Konrad Curze one of the hardest Primarchs to talk about? It is not the violence. The 41st millennium is full of violence, and the Horus Heresy is full of Primarchs who did terrible things. It is not even the specific nature of what the Night Lords did under his command. The atrocities, the terror campaigns, the deliberate cultivation of fear as a military doctrine. Other Primarchs did comparable things, or worse, depending on how you measure these things. What makes Curze hard to talk about is the question he asked. Not rhetorically, not as a justification, but as a genuine inquiry that he never resolved and that the people around him never resolved either. Was he wrong? Not about the atrocities, not about the methods, about the principle. His argument, and he had an argument, a coherent one, yet one that the Emperor never fully answered, was that terror works. That the fear of punishment deters crime more effectively than the punishment itself. That the Night Lords' campaigns of systematic horror reduce suffering in the long run by preventing the chaos that always preceded them. That he was, in his way, doing exactly what the Great Crusade claimed to be doing, bringing order to a galaxy that desperately needed it. Just more honestly than anyone else was willing to be about the methods required. He was also, by the accounts of almost everyone who knew him, a man who suffered enormously, who saw things he could not unsee, who understood what he was in ways that other Primarchs did not or would not, and who chose, in the end, not to run from what he had been made into. Konrad Curze did not die in battle. He did not die fighting. He saw his death coming, literally in the prophetic visions that had haunted him since childhood, and he sat down and waited for it. The last act of the Night Haunter was to let himself be killed. Was that peace? Madness, justice, surrender? He would probably say it was all of those things, and none of them, and that the question itself was the point. This is his story. Nostramo, the world that made him. Nostramo was a world without light, not metaphorically. The planet itself was shrouded, its sun dim and distant, its surface perpetually in a state of twilight or full dark. The human civilization that had developed on Nostramo had adapted to this in the ways that human civilizations adapt to their environments, which is to say imperfectly and with significant cost. Nostramo was a world of hive cities built from the planet's considerable mineral wealth, of an aristocracy that controlled those resources and used them to maintain a social order that was, by any reasonable measure, deeply unjust. The wealthy lived in relative comfort behind private security forces. Everyone else lived in conditions that produced exactly the kind of society you would expect such conditions to produce. One organized around survival, where the strong took from the weak and the law existed primarily to protect the interests of those who had already won. Crime was not an aberration on Nostramo. It was the operating system. Konrad Curze arrived on this world as a child and was found by no one. Unlike most of the Primarchs who were discovered and raised by individuals or communities, Curze appears to have been entirely alone from the beginning. There are no accounts of a foster family, no community that took him in, no mentor or guardian figure. He grew up on the streets of Nostramo Quintus alone, surviving by whatever means were available, in an environment that offered him no warmth and considerable cruelty. He also, from very early, had the visions. The precise nature of Curze's prophetic ability is one of the more debated aspects of his character. What is documented is that he saw the future, not comprehensively, not reliably, not with the clean clarity of a strategic asset, but in fragments and images and impressions that came to him unbidden and that were, over time, proven accurate. He saw crimes before they happened. He saw suffering that had not yet occurred. He saw, eventually, his own death in enough detail to recognize it when it came. What the visions did to a child alone on a dark world, with no framework for understanding what he was experiencing, and no one to help him make sense of it, that is not difficult to imagine. The accounts describe a Curze who was, from his earliest years, marked by what he had seen. Not broken by it, not paralyzed by it, but shaped by it in ways that never left him. He began to act on what he saw. And in The Night Haunter, the name came first from the people of Nostramo before the Emperor found him, hunted criminals, not as a law enforcement function, not as a service to the aristocracy that technically governed the hive cities, but as a direct intervention against the specific harm he had foreseen. He would appear in the places where crimes were about to happen, in the dark, and he would stop them. Not gently, not with the measured application of force that a legal system might sanction, with the kind of violence that leaves an impression. He was extraordinarily effective. The crime rates in the areas he operated in collapsed. Not because everyone became virtuous, but because the fear of what would happen to them if they did not become virtuous was sufficient motivation. Curze had discovered, through practice, what would become the central doctrine of the Night Lords, that terror, applied with sufficient consistency and sufficient horror, changes behavior more reliably than any other instrument. He had also, by this point, effectively become the de facto ruler of Nostramo, not through any formal claim or political process, but through the simple mechanism that he was the most powerful being on the planet, and the only one whose authority was backed by something the population genuinely feared. The aristocracy that had run Nostramo's criminal economy found themselves with a choice between accommodation and annihilation. Most chose accommodation. Nostramo changed under his rule. The crime did not disappear. He was not naive about human nature, but it became confined, controlled, and subject to consequences that made the calculation of whether to commit it less favorable. The hive cities became places where ordinary people could live with something approaching safety. This was, by the standards of what Nostramo had been before, a significant achievement. It was also achieved through methods that the Emperor, when he finally arrived, found deeply troubling. The Emperor came to Nostramo and found a world that was orderly and a Primarch who was haunted. The meeting between them is described in the accounts that survive as complex. The Emperor clearly valued what he found in Curze: the military genius, the strategic intelligence, the capacity for rapid, decisive action. But he also found the visions and the methods, and the specific quality of a being who had been alone in the dark for too long and who had built his entire understanding of the world around what darkness required. He took Curze with him anyway. The Night Lords, the Legion of Fear. The Night Lords were the 8th Legion, and they reflected their Primarch in ways that other legions reflected theirs. Where the Emperor's children sought perfection and the Ultramarines sought order, the Night Lords sought fear, not as an end in itself. Curze was too intelligent for simple sadism, and the legion he built was too tactically coherent for that explanation to hold. But as a means, fear was the Night Lords' primary weapon, more fundamental than their bolters or their blades, because fear worked on the enemy before the fighting started and after it ended, and during every moment in between. Their tactics were built around this: night raids against civilian populations to break enemy morale, the display of atrocities committed against combatants as warnings to those who had not yet been reached, yet the deliberate targeting of symbols of order and safety, the cultivation, over years and decades of campaigning, of a reputation sufficiently terrible that significant portions of their opponents would simply not fight when they learned who they were facing. This was effective, verifiably, measurably effective by the operational standards of the Great Crusade. Curze could demonstrate, with data from campaigns across multiple systems, that his methods achieved compliance faster and with lower total casualties, at least on the Night Lord's side, than alternatives. His argument was not that atrocity was pleasant, it was that it was efficient. Other Primarchs found this argument unconvincing for reasons that were partly moral and partly practical. Dorn objected on principle. Sanguinius found the methods antithetical to everything he believed the Great Crusade was supposed to represent. Even Horus, who was not squeamish about violence, had reservations about the specific texture of what the Night Lords were doing, about the way their campaigns seemed to go beyond what the tactical logic required, into something that felt personal rather than strategic. There are accounts from this period of Curze being called before the Emperor, of official censures and official warnings, of the same pattern that would eventually produce the Heresy, playing out in miniature with the Night Lords. The institution trying to contain something it had created that was not quite containable. Curze received the censures and continued. He was not defiant exactly. He did not dismiss the criticism or refuse to engage with it. As he argued with it, he made his case again and again that the methods produced results, that the results mattered, that the reduction of long-term suffering justified the short-term horror. He believed this. The tragedy of Curze is not that he was lying to himself, but that he might have been partly right, and knew it, and knew that being partly right was not the same as being right. The visions complicated everything. He was seeing things that had not happened, would happen, might happen, and the distinction between these was not always clear to him in the moment of seeing. He saw the heresy before it began. He saw his own role in it. He saw what would happen to Nostramo when he was gone, the planet he had spent his early years bringing to order. When reverting to exactly what it had been before him, without the constant terror of his presence to maintain the changes he had made, that reversion happened. Whether it happened because Nostramo was always going to revert without him, or because the Night Lords he had recruited from the planet had taken Nostramo's worst elements with them into the Legion, or both. The result was that Nostramo's descent back into criminality and violence provided one of the early triggers for what would become Curze's complete break with the Imperium. He destroyed it. He returned to Nostramo during the early period of the Heresy and used the Night Lord's fleet to reduce the planet to rubble. The world that had made him, the world whose darkness had shaped everything about him, he unmade. The accounts do not record what he felt about this. Perhaps he felt nothing. Perhaps he felt everything. The silence on this point in the primary sources may be the most eloquent thing in them. The question, was he made this way? There is a confrontation between Konrad Curze and Rogel Dorn during the Heresy that is worth dwelling on, because it contains what is perhaps the clearest statement of the central question of Curze's existence. Curze was captured, or allowed himself to be captured, the distinction is unclear and possibly deliberate, by Dorn's forces at some point during the Heresy's middle period. He was held on the Phalanx, Dorn's flagship. Sanguinius came to him there, along with Dorn, and what followed was one of the more philosophically significant conversations in the entire Heresy narrative. Curze asked them whether what he was had been chosen or designed, whether the Emperor had known when he came to Nostramo what Curze was, whether the visions, the darkness, if the specific shape of his character, whether all of this had been seen and accepted as the price of a useful tool, or whether the Emperor had genuinely not known what he was bringing into the Great Crusade. He asked Sanguinius, "You know the future too. You have seen your own death. Did the Emperor know yours?" Sanguinius had no answer that satisfied Curze, and Curze, in the accounts of this conversation, was not looking to be satisfied. He was looking for the truth of whether he had ever had a choice, whether the being he had become was the inevitable product of Nostramo and the visions and the specific context of his upbringing, or whether there had been a moment where he could have become something else. He subsequently escaped from the Phalanx, incidentally. The escape itself, committing acts of considerable violence against Dorn's fortress ship in the process, rather undermined any claim he might have made to the moral high ground in that conversation. Whether this undermining was intentional on his part, a demonstration that the question was irrelevant because the behavior was the behavior regardless of its origin, is one of the many things about Curze that cannot be cleanly resolved. The question itself, though, does not go away because of his behavior. It is a genuine question, not in the sense that it has a clean answer, it does not, but in the sense that the way you answer it changes how you understand everything about Curze. If he was made this way by forces entirely outside his control, then his story is a tragedy without a villain. If he had choices and made bad ones, it is something more morally complex. If the truth is somewhere in between, which it almost certainly is, then the work of understanding him is the work of figuring out where exactly in between. The Emperor never fully answered this question. Curze never stopped asking it. The Heresy, the Night Lord's War. The Night Lord's role in the Heresy was consistent with everything they had been before it, a force whose primary contribution was terror, whose tactical signature was the atrocity that prevented the need for further atrocities, whose presence in a theater of war changed the psychological calculus of everyone else operating there. They were not Horus's most militarily significant force. They did not have the raw power of the World Eaters or the strategic significance of the Sons of Horus. What they had was a specific effect on the populations and forces in the regions they operated, a quality of dread that spread in advance of their actual physical presence, that made holding territory against them a test not of military capability, but of psychological endurance. And Curze himself operated with the specific quality that had always defined him: brilliant, intuitive, capable of violence that went beyond what the tactical situation strictly required, and haunted by visions that he could not control and could not ignore. He fought in the Heresy not with the conviction of a true believer like Lorgar or the ambition of Horus, but with the sense of someone following a path that had been laid out for him before he was capable of choosing it. There is something important in the accounts of Curze during the Heresy that distinguishes him from almost all of the other traitor Primarchs. He does not appear to have believed in the Chaos Gods. He does not appear to have sought their favor or accepted their gifts in the way that Fulgrim or Mortarion did. The Night Lords as a legion did not dedicate themselves to any of the four powers during the Heresy, in the way that the Word-bearers or the Emperor's children did. They served Horus's cause not out of theological conviction, but out of a combination of genuine grievance against the Emperor and the simple fact that the alternative was fighting on behalf of the institution that had spent decades telling Curze he was doing it wrong. This matters for understanding what the Night Lords became after the Heresy. They are, among the traitor legions, one of the most consistently self-interested, not devoted to the Long War in the way that the Black Legion is, not serving a specific Chaos God with the consistency of the Death Guard or the Thousand Sons. They raid, they terrorize, they take what they need and move on. The philosophical framework that Curze built around terror as a tool persists in them, but stripped of whatever moral content it had when Curze was alive to provide it. He spent parts of the Heresy in what can only be described as hunting operations, targeted campaigns against specific individuals or groups who had opposed him, conducted with the personal intensity of someone for whom the war was not primarily ideological. The Night Haunter remained exactly that throughout the Heresy. A hunter in the dark, someone whose relationship to the conflict was always more personal than strategic. He also, during this period, continued to have the visions, continued to see the future in fragments, and saw, with increasing clarity, how his own story ended. The Scouring, running and waiting. After the Heresy ended, after Horus fell and the traitors retreated, the Night Lords did not go quietly into the Eye of Terror the way other legions did. They scattered. They dispersed across the galaxy in war bands, raiding, terrorizing, surviving. The institutional coherence that Curze had built, which was never strong to begin with because fear is not a foundation on which you build lasting loyalty, fragmented almost immediately. The Night Lords became what they remain in the 41st millennium, a collection of independent and frequently antagonistic warbands united only by their tactical signature and their color scheme. Curze himself went to ground. He moved through the darkness at the edges of the Imperium, hunted by the forces of the Imperium's Scouring, or evading capture with the skill of a being who had spent his entire life in exactly this kind of existence. He was alone, or nearly so. He had outlived the cause he had nominally served. He had outlived most of the relationships, such as they were, that had defined his existence during the Heresy. And he had the visions. He saw, with increasing clarity, how it ended. The assassin, the room, the moment. He saw it often enough and clearly enough that when it finally came, there would be no possibility of mistaking it for something else. He went to Tsagualsa. Tsagualsa was a dead world, abandoned, in the outer darkness of the galaxy. Curze went there, and he waited. He built himself a throne room in the ruins of what had once been a civilization. He sat in the dark, and he waited for what was coming. The accounts of this period, brief as they are, the sources for the end of Curze's story are limited, suggest a being who was not desperate or broken, but deliberate. He had made a choice. Whether it was the right choice, whether it was even a choice in any meaningful sense given the determinism his visions implied, was the question he had been asking his whole life. He was asking it still. He waited for the assassin. He could have fled. He had evaded the Imperium for years. He was not incapable of continuing to evade it. He chose not to. The Calidus assassin Mishen came to Tsagualsa. She found Curze exactly where he was waiting. The accounts of the final moments are fragmentary. Curze himself apparently spoke. made the question explicit one last time, asking whether what he had done had been wrong, whether the Emperor had made him this way or whether he had chosen it, whether the darkness that had defined him was justice or crime. She killed him. His final words in the accounts that survive were, "My death is meaningless. My life was." The question was not what I did, but what was done to me. Whether this was true, whether it was self-justification, whether it was the honest final statement of a being who had been asking the same question since childhood. The accounts leave this open, as they must. There is no clean answer to whether Konrad Curze was right. The Night Lords after, what he left behind. The Night Lords in the 41st millennium are among the most active of the traitor legions, in the sense that they operate constantly across a wide range of theaters. They are also among the least organized. There is no Night Haunter to hold them together. There is no ideology beyond the tactical logic of terror and the practical motivation of survival and acquisition. What persists is the method. The Night Lords still fight the way Curze taught them, in the dark, against morale as much as against bodies, through the cultivation of dread as a force multiplier. They still paint their armor in the lightning bolt motifs that Curze established, still use the iconography of fear that he made the Legion's signature. In this aesthetic sense, they are more consistent than many traitor legions. In every other sense, they are fragmented, individual warbands pursuing individual goals with only the most tactical cooperation. They raid imperial worlds. They hire out as mercenary forces. They pursue private vendettas. The coherent force that Curze had built, however imperfectly and however fundamentally built on a foundation of terror rather than loyalty, does not exist anymore. This is perhaps what Curze would have expected. He understood that fear was not permanent, that what it bought was time, not transformation, that the order he had imposed on Nostramo had collapsed when he left because he had never truly changed what the people of Nostramo were, only what they did while they were afraid. The Night Lords without the Night Haunter are the same thing at the Legion scale. The fear that held them together departed with him. Whether he would have found this vindicating or simply inevitable is unclear. He had never claimed that his methods produced permanent solutions, only that they produced results when applied. The question of what happened after the terror ended was, he might have said, someone else's problem. He was many things. He was not someone who pretended to answers he did not have. Who Konrad Curze was, the question without an answer. The question Curze asked, was I right, does not have a clean answer. That is the point of it. It was never meant to have a clean answer. What it was meant to do was force the people he asked it to confront the specific discomfort of a being who operated at the intersection of several different kinds of truth. He was right that terror works. He was right that the Emperor's secular vision of the Imperium was built on certain convenient omissions about what maintaining order actually required. He was right that the institutions of the Great Crusade were, in various ways, dishonest about the violence they used and the suffering they caused in the name of the civilization they were building. He was also a being who committed atrocities, who allowed, and in many cases directed, the murder of civilian populations, who built a legion culture around something so close to sadism that the distinction between doctrine and pathology is genuinely difficult to locate. The tragedy of Curze is not that he was evil, it is that he was partly right and entirely incapable of using that partial rightness for anything constructive. The same insight that identified the hypocrisy in the Imperium's self-presentation produced a being who could not build anything, only destroy, who could maintain order through terror, but could not maintain it through anything else, who understood suffering with the specific clarity of someone who had seen too much of it and had somehow concluded that the answer was more of it, more controlled, more purposeful. He saw the future in fragments and could not change it, but he saw the present clearly enough to identify its failures and could not fix them. He was, in the most precise sense, a being defined by what he could not do, and what he could not do was believe that something better was possible. That is not unique to Curze. It is a specific kind of despair that exists in anyone who looks at the world clearly enough to see how badly it fails its own ideals, and who cannot find a way from the seeing to the possibility of something different. Curze simply had the particular curse of being one of the most powerful beings in human history while experiencing it. He built his throne in the dark on a dead world and waited for the blade he had seen coming for years. And in that waiting, in the refusal to run, in the deliberate acceptance of the ending, there was something that might have been, if not peace, then at least the resolution of the question into a form he could live with, or die with. The Night Lords are out there still, in their scattered and independent warbands, operating in the darkness at the edges of civilization. They do not have his question to animate them. They have only the method, stripped of whatever meaning he gave it. Somewhere in the dark, the echoes of Nostramo persist. The planet is gone, he destroyed it himself. But what Nostramo made is still moving through the galaxy, still spreading what it learned on those dim-lit streets, still doing what darkness has always done, which is to say, enduring.